Chicago skyline. Just a little bit of that cloudy haze, but it does make for a beautiful picture straight ahead. Some of the buildings we're going to talk about. And we're going to talk about our first building, and it's this building here to the left. This massive tower with the 3 separate towers at different heights, right? This is the St. Regis. This is a very new building. It's actually still partially under construction. And it's a really important building because it's actually the tallest building in the world, designed by a female-led architecture firm. Now, who's the woman that leads that firm? Jeannie Gang. Jeannie Gang is a really important name here in Chicago. She's a Chicagoland native architect, and she has been crushing it lately. So she's the architect who designed Maggie Daley Park. That's a park here in the downtown area. She also designed 2 boat harbors here in the city. And she just landed a contract to redesign parts of O'Hare International Airport. So if you know anyone from Chicago, you might have heard us complain about O'Hare, the site's there. So we're hoping that Jeannie Gang can breathe some fresh life into the airport for us. Now, this is the first time I'm going to nerd out and talk about some engineering. And there's something that was utilized in the St. Regis called post-tensioning in concrete. And let me explain why that's important. Now, in a typical floor plank on one of these skyscrapers, they're made by laying down a grid of metal rebar poles. You pour concrete on top of that, the concrete sets, and that's your floor plank. With post-tensioning, you also lay down steel cables in the grid alongside those rebar poles. They're about the thickness of my finger. They're coated in plastic and greased. So you lay those down with the rebar, you pour your concrete, that sets. And since those cables are greased, you can use machinery to actually pull the cables really, really tight on all 4 sides. And what that does is it makes a floor plank that's much stiffer and much stronger. So it allows these builders to make floor planks that are 1/3 less thick, 1/3 less heavy, and 1/3 less the cost. So you can imagine why that is a really, really important innovation, because it saves quite a bit of money in building these buildings, and it allows them to build them even taller with the same budget, right? And just as secure. So a really important innovation there. Now, of course, we are on the Chicago River right now. This is a really important river when it comes to Chicago's history. And it actually, although it flows in this direction of travel that we're going right now, it used to flow in the opposite direction and empty into Lake Michigan. For much of the 1800s, it emptied into Lake Michigan. But the problem was, like many early industrial cities in the U.S. built on rivers, Chicago treated the Chicago River like a sewer. And I mean that in every definition of the word sewer.
River, al que no sepa es río, eh? Aquí vamos por el río.
And not only was that bad for the lake because the wildlife in there were getting polluted, right? But the city was also using Lake Michigan as its #1 source of fresh drinking water. So I don't need to go into detail about why that's really bad and gross and needed to change. So in the early 1900s, the Army Corps of Engineers spent about 11 years digging a 28-mile channel all the way out west to the Western River system and used gravity to change the direction of flow of the Chicago River. A pretty incredible feat of engineering that allows us to have this beautiful river here today. And at the time, saved a lot of people in the city dying of cholera. So I'm sure they were very grateful for that. All right, now we're going to talk about a few more buildings straight ahead. We're going to talk about this building here on the right with the clock tower that's got the stone facade. Now this is a Chicago favorite, the iconic Wrigley building. If you've heard of Wrigley's Juicy Fruit Gum, that's the same Wrigley. Now, this building was built in the early 1920s. It's an example of Spanish Revival-style architecture, and it was modeled after a cathedral in Seville, Spain. Now, it's covered in over 250,000 glazed terracotta tiles. So you can imagine how painstaking of a process it was to construct one of these facades. Now, a facade is a fancy way of saying face or the front of the building, the exterior. Now, this was modeled after that cathedral in Spain, right? So why were U.S. architects building structures modeled after cathedrals in Spain? Well, That's because our architects here in the United States in the early 1920s didn't have their own styles yet. So they were imitating or replicating what they knew. And those were the grand architectural styles of Europe. Hence, a Spanish cathedral for the Wrigley Building. All right, our next architectural marvel straight ahead, we have the Trump International Hotel and Tower. Now this building was finished being built in 2009, designed by Chicago's very own Skidmore, Owings & Merrill. That's a local architecture firm. The specific architect was a man by the name of Adrian Smith. And he's referred to as the tallest architect in the world, not because he's very tall, he's actually only 5'7", but because he's the guy who's designed many of the tallest buildings in the world. Now this style is a great example of something called contextualism, and let me explain how that works. So you see the three patio setbacks at different heights. You have 1, 2, 3. This first patio is actually at the same height as the roof of the Wrigley Building. The second patio is at the same height as this rocket-shaped looking building across the river, the Jeweler's Building. And that third patio up there on the right is at the same height as the roof of this black boxy building on the other side. So that's contextualism. It's all about honoring the context and the environment that surround a building. Sort of an architect's way of giving a little fist bump or a handshake to the buildings nearby. Now the top level penthouse, so that's the residential space on the top floor of this building, sold back in 2014 for $17 million. Pocket change for most of us, though, right? All right, to the right, eyes up, cameras up. One of my favorite buildings on the tour, the twin iconic corncob towers of Marina City. Now, these buildings were designed and built in the 1960s by an architect named Bertrand Goldberg. And Goldberg was more of a social scientist of the group. He was really interested in how people lived. So he wanted to construct a fully self-sufficient, self-contained city within a city. So the way that it works is you live up in the condo, or you have to furnish your pie-shaped living room. A little difficult, but I'm told it can be done. And then you live above your valet parked car, above your parked yacht, because who doesn't have a yacht? And you live above a restaurant, a movie theater, a bowling alley, some shopping, and an office space. So again, this is fully self-contained city within a city. Some people call it an introvert's dream world. All right, over here to the left, you see a little stretch of the iconic Chicago Riverwalk. This is a project conceived in 1909, but it wasn't started under construction till about 2003. Finished in recent years, and it cost the city $112 million to construct. But it was worth every penny because it's absolutely transformed the city's relationship with the river, bringing more people down to the river's edge than ever before in the city's history. So, pretty important development. All right, to the left, you see this mirror-ribbed glass building with the white granite. This is an example of the neoclassical style of architecture. So if you look at the top of that building, it looks a bit like a temple, maybe like the Parthenon. And that's how the neoclassical style works. You have key traits and features of classical architecture styles built with modern materials with a bit more of a modern look to them. Now, the area of the city that building is located in is called the Loop. And it's called the Loop because our train system, nicknamed the L, short for elevated, as a lot of the tracks are raised above ground, run in a loop around this sort of downtown business center of the city. Chicago is located where it is because of the river that we're on, the Chicago River. We already talked about how the river flow was reversed in the early 1900s. Now, the city was founded in the 1830s, and for much of the rest of that century, the 1800s, this was the primary method of transportation between the East Coast and the center of the country. So you could actually take a series of lakes, rivers, locks, canals from the ocean on the East Coast all the way down here to the center of the country in Chicago. So again, this river is absolutely crucial to the city of Chicago's success. All right, this building here to the left with the black stripe of windows down the front towards the right. The section on the left side of that stripe was built in 1927. The section on the right was built in 1987, so a 60-year difference. But this is a great example of how Chicago honors its architectural heritage. So the architect on the right wanted to honor the intention of the architect on the left, so it's the same basic style, same colors, same materials, a little bit more modern, a little sleeker, right? New windows, but the same basic idea. The Wells Street Bridge that we're passing under right now is another great example of that. Although this bridge does look like a lot of the iconic Chicago-style bridges that you'll see on the tour, it's only 8 years old. Many of the other bridges are decades, if not close to a century old, and that's because this was designed to be a replica of those. All right, eyes up, cameras up, to the right, one of my favorite buildings on the tour, the massive Merchandise Mart. Now this is our next architectural style, known as Art Deco. This building is from 1929. Some key features include those deep inset windows which create vertical racing stripes that draw your eye upward. The building narrows at the top, it's covered in precision repetitive patterns. It's got that streamlined verticality. It's covered in polished Bedford, Indiana limestone and finished with metal ornaments. Now again, this is a style from the late 1920s, and it was short-lived, though prolific, and prolific means that you can see Art Deco buildings across the country in cities in the United States. And this style was intended to express the optimism that folks in this country had for a machine-made American future. All right, this is Wolf Point, 360 degrees of amazing. This is where the three branches of the Chicago River converge into one. It's also where the city started. So there were just a couple taverns and trading posts here on the river's edge in the 1830s, which is pretty crazy to think about considering the way it looks now. All right, this curved glass building here to the left, this is the Nuveen building from 1983, and it's another great example of contextualism. Why? Well, the curve of the building matches the curve of the river, and the two rows of different colored glass, you have the blue that reflects the blue of the sky and the green that reflects the turquoise green of the river. So again, that's contextualism. It's about making the neighborhood look good. Also, fun fact, this is the building where Ferris Bueller's dad worked in the little-known Chicago documentary, Ferris Bueller's Day Off. All right, I love to point out River Point building. That's this building straight in front of us with a U-shaped base. Not because of its beautiful architecture, it is a beautiful building, but mostly just because it looks, I don't know, like a Hot Pocket or a McDonald's cherry pie box. I'm always very hungry when I come on these tours, so it's a little dangerous to talk about Hot Pockets. All right, this building straight ahead on the left side of the river that's peach-colored, this is the Fulton House. It's the oldest building that you'll see on the river. It's from 1898, and it was built with no windows as a building for the, as a cold storage freezer building for the meat packing industry. Now, the business that operated out of there left in 1971, and it was said that it took over 3 months for the building to thaw out. And it was due in large part to the builders discovering 4-foot thick walls stuffed with matted horsehair and cork, which was actually an early version of insulation. This was before styrofoam was invented. And apparently a very effective form of insulation. 3 months we're talking. Now, that business, of course, left in the 70s. They sold the building, and it was renovated. There was a full gut rehab and external renovation, and the windows and balconies were added, and now it is a residential building. But a very, very historic building, of course. All right, now this bridge here on the right that's raised in the air, this bridge is no longer in operation, but it's a great example of the massive amount of weight needed to lift one of these bridges in the air. So if you see that big chunk of concrete on the right there, that's what's needed to be able to raise that bridge in the air. So this bridge is permanently raised, and it'll stay like that. All right, my favorite building on the tour, coming up on the left, right after Fulton House, this building with the triangles on the roof. This is the River Cottages, built in 1988, designed by architect Harry Weiss. This is our only example of postmodern architecture on the tour today. Harry Weiss was real infatuated with triangles, can you tell? Probably had a lot to do with his love of sailboats with their triangular sails. Now, a lot of people thought that Harry Weiss was crazy for building a residential building on the North Branch of the Chicago River. We're on the North Branch right now, and that's because in the 80s, this branch of the Chicago River was still really industrial, and so it was gross. It smelled bad, it was polluted, it wasn't a very nice site. But because of architects like Harry Weiss, the city's relationship with the river changed dramatically, especially over the past 30 to 40 years. Now, over here to the right, this is a great example of that changing relationship. So this massive building here is the East Bank Club. It is a high-end fitness center built in 1980. And you might recognize the names of some folks who worked out there, like Barack Obama or Oprah Winfrey. And I point this building out because, as you can tell, it kind of looks like the back of the building is facing the river, right? And that's because it is. In the 80s, this building did what any new development would do to a river that was polluted, and it treated the river like an alleyway. Right? But if you look across the river to these buildings here, these were constructed in 2001, and these are residential buildings. So you can tell, in those 21 years, the city's relationship with the river changed in a huge way. You have balconies, a walk space, benches, greenery. So this was intended to be the front of these developments here. So that shows you how that relationship changed.
Ya vamos a dar la vuelta, ¿ok?
All right, we're going to take our first U-turn of the trip. We're going to head back down to Wolf Point and into the South Branch of the Chicago River. So this is a perfect time to go refresh your drink, go visit Zach at the bar, stretch your legs, hit up the bathrooms, take some photos if you'd like. I'm going to be available to take your photos, or I'll also be available to answer some questions if you have any. I'm going to hop off the mic and I'll be back in just a couple minutes.
Estamos dando la pinche vuelta, la vuelta en una pata. Cálmate, Adrián, cabrón, me mueves feo. ¿Y la cachucha de Esteban aquí? ¿Qué dice que la vieja qué?
Busy night in the river. Of course, the river, it's like a street, right? So you got traffic sometimes. You might have to wait a little bit for people to go by. All right, so I have some pre-COVID information for you. So before the pandemic hit, Chicago was experiencing a residential building boom in its downtown city center. And that's because the city, when it was first founded, The downtown area was mostly industrial, meaning that it was dirty, it wasn't very safe, there wasn't a lot to do, and there were barely any places to live. But that has all changed dramatically. I already sort of talked about that with the changing relationship to the river. Over the past 30 years specifically, something called the Great Inversion happened, and that happened in a lot of U.S. cities, and that's when a city's population relocates from the periphery to the city center. So people from the suburbs, they gave up their lawnmowers and snowblowers and minivans and maybe even their kids and decided to move to the city center. Because if you could get rid of your commute, why wouldn't you? Especially once companies started moving their offices or their headquarters here to the downtown area, it made it easier for people to live here. Also, any building that has balconies on it is a residential building. So that shows you just how much residential space is here on the river's edge today. Again, a big difference from even the 1980s or the early 90s.
Ay, para que visiten a Chicago, gallos,
All right, these two buildings here on the right, you have this building with the stone facade that's curved inward, and then you have the Hot Pocket building I mentioned earlier with the outward curve. Now, these two curves are inversions of each other, which means they share the same radius, but even cooler, the radius of these two buildings is imitating the radius of the curve on the new Veen building. And so that's contextualism. It's all hiding in plain sight. You might not even be able to find it unless you know where to look and how to look for it. But it's sort of these buildings' way of giving a high five to the new Veen building, which came before them. All right, we're going to nerd out again. And we're going to talk about this building straight ahead on the right side of the river with the narrow base in the shape of a Y. Now this is 150 North Riverside, and it's only a few years old, designed by Gesh Partners. And the reasons why it has such a narrow base, the back 2/3 of that lot are occupied by active Amtrak Metra train lines. And in front, the city requires all new buildings to have a 30-foot setback from the river's edge. That leaves this building occupied.
Ahora sí vamos a rumbo a la tienda ya para donde tengo las botas,
lot space. So the question then becomes, well, with
ya agarramos
such a skinny building,
el río rumbo al sur.
Very narrow base, does it sway in the wind? And the answer is yes, it does. Many of the buildings in the Chicago skyline actually do sway in the wind. Now there are a few ways that you can minimize that sway. And the system this building used is something called inertial slosh dampers. I know that's a mouthful, so let me explain how that works. On the top floor, there are 12 barrels full of 160,000 gallons of water. So imagine I'm the building, right? The wind comes and hits me on this side, and I start to sway in this direction. Well, when I sway, the water in those barrels sloshes in the opposite direction. And then I go back this way, and the water sloshes that way, and so on and so forth. And so what that does is it has an equalizing effect, and it brings the building to rest much more quickly. Also, I'd like to point out, you can see yourself in the windows. That's us. But even 20 years ago, a building like this might not have been able to be constructed on this lot, right? Because they didn't have those kinds of technologies at the time. Pretty cool innovation. All right, here to the left, this is a great example of about how long it takes to build a building and how much it costs to build one on the river these days. So this building is the Bank of America building, and it took about 3 years to build, and it cost $750 million. So that's pretty standard for a new building on the river these days. Now remember the 30-foot setback rule for 150 North Riverside? Well, this building had the same rule, but it dealt with it a little differently. It vaulted the third floor with those silver tripod legs, and it followed the zoning law, but then also added some plaza space here underneath. So some space for folks to come out, enjoy the river's edge, get some fresh air. Also, these metal panels below the building on the riverside, those actually came from the building that used to stand in that lot that was torn down for the Bank of America building. So another great example of Chicago honoring its architectural heritage. All right, I'm going to give you a quick history lesson on the evolution of Chicago architecture with these next 5 buildings here on the right. And we're going to start with this building right here. It's another Art Deco building from 1929. Again, you have the streamlined verticality and the repetitive patterns all over. That's how you know it's Art Deco. Now, in 1929, the stock market crashed here in the United States. And that sent the country into the Great Depression, which was the greatest economic downturn that the country's ever experienced. So from about 1930 to 1957, roughly, there were basically no new office buildings built anywhere in the country. It was sort of like an architectural drought. Now, buildings were being constructed, but on a smaller scale, and no new styles were being developed. In the late 1950s, Chicagoland native architect Ludwig Mies van der Rohe comes on the scene and introduces us to a style of modernist building that we like to call black box modernism. It's a pretty straightforward name for it, right? Now, the people that were alive and working in the 50s and 60s, they were Depression-era kids, so they were frugal. They didn't want to spend too much money. They didn't want to put gargoyles or limestone on their buildings. They were looking for something simple and efficient. And Mies van der Rohe came on the scene and said, how about the simple elegance of a black box? And that's how we get black box modernism. Now, Mies van der Rohe was probably the most influential architect of the 20th century here in the United States. He's the guy that coined the phrase, less is more. And he believed that form follows function. Those are two phrases you may have heard before. Now, something else you'll notice about these black box buildings is they often have a lot of trees around the base, right? Now, those trees are there intentionally, and that's because the buildings are kind of stark, they're dark, they're not super exciting to look at. So the plazas were an opportunity for the builders to humanize the buildings by putting some green space down there for people to come out and gather, enjoy some fresh air, some sunshine on their breaks. All right, so we've gone from Art Deco to black box modernism. This next building, this white box, this is from 1971, the Fifth Third Center, and it's an example of the international style of architecture. And this is a style that you can see in pretty much any major city in the country from the 70s, and it's the same basic idea. Simple and efficient, but a little lighter, a little brighter, made with stone and concrete, and not all that black steel. Then the 80s comes along, and in the 80s people have shoulder pads, and there's hair bands. People were looking for something flashier and brighter, and that's when contextualism enters the scene. We've already talked about it a few times. So this glass curved building here, that's contextualism, and that curve reflects the neighborhood and makes things look good. People were asking often for the first time in the 80s, how do you get along with people who are different from you? And contextualism is architecture's answer to that. I do love pointing out the irony of a bakery next to a fitness center. Nothing interesting architecturally, just I think it's kind of funny. Maybe a brilliant marketing strategy. All right, coming into view, this building on the left, for a long time this was a pretty standard black box building, but a few years ago the owners really wanted to feel special. So they spent $800,000 to put themselves on the map by putting the map on themselves. So this is a 2-scale map of the Chicago River. That red brick up there is this building. So if you ever find yourself lost on the river, if you can find your way back here, maybe you'll have a chance. All right, Batman fans, unite. Let's nerd out. This stone-clad building here on the right, this is the old Main Post Office, but you might recognize it as Gotham City Bank from the beginning of 2008's The Dark Knight. So this was the building that the Joker and his henchmen robbed. Fun fact, my friend Brian is a stuntman based in Chicago, and he was the henchman that ziplined from the roof of a nearby building onto the roof of the old Main Post Office. Still his favorite credit he's ever done. Now the building was abandoned, it was empty at the time that film was shot here, but it was purchased a few years later and a lot of money has been spent on it to rehab the building. Total of $900 million was spent on this building in purchasing and renovations. So, of course, it is a massive building, so that explains why it costs so much. Now it's home to companies like Walgreens, PepsiCo, Uber, Home Chef. My favorite fact about this building, though, is that the roof is now home to a 3.5-acre green space called the Meadow. So it's basically a small park on the roof. And that's a standard with new buildings or buildings that are renovated. So a green space provides a space for people to come outside, get some fresh air, but also it helps to insulate the building, which is good for your heating and cooling costs. All right, now as promised, we're gonna shift gears, and this is where I'm gonna tell you three stories in particular, that give you some historical context to the architecture that we're seeing tonight. And the first story is about the Great Chicago Fire. So it was 1871, October 8th, a Sunday night at 9 p.m. A fire broke out in Mrs. O'Leary's barn, which was less than a mile to our right here. We don't know exactly how the fire started, but we'll get to that more in a minute. But we do know that the 30-mile-per-hour winds happening in the city over the next few days made it so much more devastating. The fire raged over the course of 3 days, and when all was said and done, over 17,000 buildings had burnt down, over 100,000 people were left homeless with no possessions, over 300 people died, and a 3.5-square-mile chunk of the city center was destroyed. Hugely devastating, right? So the question, though, is always, okay, but how did the fire start? And that's where the myth comes in. Now, Mrs. O'Leary, it was her barn, remember? She was an Irish Catholic immigrant, and the city was looking for someone to blame, and she fit the bill. But they didn't blame her exactly. They blamed her cow. Yes, they said that Mrs. O'Leary's cow kicked over the kerosene lantern that started the Great Chicago Fire. But I'm from Southern Illinois originally. I've known a lot of cows. Some Irish cows too, and I don't think it was the cow. I think it was set up. I think it was framed. In fact, I might go so far as to say it was a cowspiracy. Actually, I think it is utterly unjust that the city had a beef with Mrs. O'Leary, who had to hoof it out of town. Hey, that's what I heard. Now, holy cow, I know there was a lot at stake.